We all share this kind of collective cultural fantasy about growing up in a grand historical chateau.
Oh, absolutely. The velvet suits, the sprawling geometric gardens.
Right. And just the absolute freedom of running down these endless tapestried hallways while, like, a whole army of adoring servants lives on with
Ah.
fond smiles.
Yeah, it's a very romantic image. It's the fairy tale version of history we get from movies and storybooks.
Or being a young noble just means having a lot of toys and eating pastries all day.
Exactly. But it couldn't be further from the truth.
No, it couldn't. And today, we're going to peel back that velvet curtain. Because when you look at the historical reality of what it actually took to raise an aristocratic child, that fairy tale just vanishes instantly.
It really does. What you are left with isn't a life of leisure at all.
No, it is essentially a high-stakes, highly surveilled boot camp. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a truly fascinating document from the year 1700.
A very specific, very intense document.
Yeah. It's a French manual called La Maison Reglée, which translates to the regulated house. It was written by a man named Audiger, who he essentially wrote the ultimate exhaustive rule book for running a noble household.
And, exhaustive is almost an understatement here. Audiger wasn't just some casual observer.
Right, he was on the inside.
He served European royalty directly, so he wasn't offering friendly suggestions on domestic bliss. He was laying out the exact corporate structure of aristocratic life, right down to the smallest detail.
And our mission today is to explore one specific, highly orchestrated machine within that massive corporate structure, the child-rearing apparatus.
The machine that produced the next generation.
Exactly. We're going to examine the four key figures whose entire lives were dedicated to, and honestly, heavily restricted by, a young noble's care.
We're looking at the nurse, the governess, the governor, and the children's valet.
But before we get into the wild rules governing these four people, I need you to set the stage for me. Why was raising a child in 1700 such an intense militaristic operation?
Well, to understand that, we really have to look at the massive political shift happening in France around 1700.
Okay.
This is the era of Louis XIV, right, the Sun King. And he had completely changed the game for the nobility.
How so?
Well, for centuries, French nobles were essentially provincial warlords. Their power came from the fact that they had massive estates, thick castle walls, and, their own private armies.
So if you were a noble in, say, 1500, your main concern was making sure your kid knew how to ride a horse, swing a heavy sword, and just survive a siege.
Precisely. But Louis XIV systematically stripped them of that military independence. He forced the most powerful families to move to his court at Versailles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he transitioned them from warlords to courtiers. So suddenly, power was no longer about having the biggest sword.
He was about politics.
Power was about proximity to the king, making strategic alliances, and above all, flawless etiquette.
Okay, so the battlefield completely changed. It went from a literal field of mud and steel to like the polished parquet floors of Versailles.
And the stakes on that new battlefield were incredibly high. Raising a noble child wasn't about parenting in our modern sense of, emotional bonding or self-discovery.
Right, it wasn't about finding yourself.
Not at all. It was about protecting a dynasty. A single heir represented the family's entire wealth, their land, and their political survival.
So failure wasn't an option.
No. If the child died, which was highly probable in an era of terrible medicine, or if they grew up to be a socially inept brute who used the wrong title or insulted the wrong duke at court,
That could ruin them.
it could literally mean the financial and social ruin of an ancient family name.
They would lose their monopolies, their royal stipends, their status, everything.
Everything. So you couldn't leave child rearing to chance. It had to be a perfectly regulated machine.
Well, let's look at the very first gear in that machine. Because before a noble child could learn how to navigate the social minefield of Versailles, they had to actually survive infancy.
Which was a massive hurdle.
Right. And in 1700, escaping infancy was no small feat. That immense, terrifying biological burden fell to the first line of defense, the nurse or the nourrice.
That's right. Physical survival was the absolute non-negotiable priority here.
And the mother wasn't the one doing this, right?
No, the noble mother rarely breastfed the child herself. That was considered beneath her status. So the manual places an incredible amount of pressure on the hired nurse.
It really does.
Her entire existence, her body, and her lifestyle were dictated by the preservation and quality of her breast milk.
Okay, let's unpack this because the instructions Audiger lays out for her are just mind-boggling.
They are so strict.
She is placed under intense physical and lifestyle restrictions. To protect the milk, she is ordered to eat a very specific, heavily regulated diet. She must have a substantial breakfast and a mandatory afternoon snack.
And very little wine, which was unusual for the time.
Right, and here is the kicker that really threw me. She's commanded to abstain entirely from seeing her own husband during the entire time she is nursing the noble child.
Yeah, total separation.
Why on earth was that necessary?
It sounds incredibly cruel to us, right? Like a bizarre moral judgment.
Yeah.
But it was actually based on the cutting-edge medical consensus of the time, which was humoral theory.
Humoral theory. Okay.
Yeah, in 1700, doctors didn't know about germs or calories or micronutrients. They believed the human body was controlled by 4 liquids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile.
Right, the ancient Greek medical concept that somehow survived for, like, centuries.
It's exactly. And in humoral theory, emotions and physical actions aren't just invisible feelings. They are chemical reactions that literally alter the temperature and composition of those bodily liquids.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Breast milk was thought to be directly derived from the blood. So the medical fear was that marital relations would physically heat the blood, which would then curdle or corrupt the milk.
Wow. So they aren't keeping her husband away just to be mean or to keep her focused on the job?
No, not at all.
They literally believe the physical excitement of seeing her husband will chemically cook the food supply of the aristocratic heir.
It was pure medical risk mitigation. Every single thing the nurse experienced, consumed, or felt was believed to be directly transmitted to the noble infant.
That is so much pressure.
If she drank too much wine, the milk would be too hot. If she was melancholic or angry, her humors would shift, the milk would become sour, and the baby would physically absorb that miserable, angry temperament.
Which perfectly explains the other crazy rule in the manual.
Yeah.
She was commanded to be relentlessly cheerful.
Forced positivity.
The text explicitly says she must sing and laugh constantly to amuse the infant. So, the psychological state of the nurse was a strict medical matter.
She was, for all intents and purposes, a living, breathing medical device for the aristocracy.
It's astonishing. You are separated from your own family, banned from your spouse, and ordered to literally laugh and sing all day on command, just to keep your biological outputs perfectly calibrated.
And while she's managing this forced cheerfulness, she is also navigating terrifying safety protocols.
Oh, right, the swaddling.
Audiger's manual outlines exactly how she must swaddle the baby. It can't be too tight, or it restricts the humors, but not too loose, or the limbs might grow crooked.
And the pins. She has to constantly, obsessively check that none of the pins used in the layers of 18th century clothing have pricked the baby.
Yes, and the text notes that sleeping was a high-anxiety event.
Right.
She had to position herself so carefully to ensure she didn't roll over and crush the child in the night.
It's so much pressure that the manual actually assigns the nurse her own servant.
Yes.
The servant's entire job is to rock the baby and run errands so the nurse doesn't physically exert herself. The servant has a servant.
Which perfectly illustrates the cascading hierarchy of this world. The aristocracy throws specialized labor at every conceivable problem.
Okay, so the biological threat of early infancy is managed. The child survives the swaddling and the humoral milk and grows into a toddler.
A very fragile toddler.
Right. And at this point, the physical baton is passed from the nurse to the governess, the gouvernante d'enfant. And her job description is this fascinating, almost impossible tightrope walk.
It really is. She has to balance extreme sweetness with unwavering strictness.
Audiger writes that she can never tolerate what the book calls wickedness, but she has to correct the child without any bitterness.
No anger allowed.
It explicitly notes that nobles absolutely abhorred cruel humor in their staff.
That is a very telling detail about class dynamics. The aristocracy absolutely wanted discipline. They needed the child to be obedient, but they did not want their precious heir traumatized or, more importantly, influenced by low-born anger.
That makes sense.
The governess had to project this perfect, serene, almost divine authority at all times. She couldn't yell or snap.
But here is the medical detail regarding the governess that really stopped me in my tracks.
Oh, the crying.
Yes, and I have to push back on the logic here. The governess is strictly ordered to prevent the child from crying too much or from making any intense physical efforts. And the reason given isn't about noise control or keeping the house quiet. The manual warns that crying could cause hernias, which they called dissentis, or lead to lifelong physical maladies.
Yes, it was a massive fear.
It was a highly trained governess, seriously terrified that a normal toddler crying fit would literally break the child's body forever.
Absolutely terrified. And to understand why that fear was so genuine, you have to realize the brutal reality of 18th century surgery.
Which was basically non-existent, right?
If a child today gets an umbilical or inguinal hernia from straining, it's stressful, sure, but it's a routine, safe, outpatient procedure. We have anesthesia and antibiotics.
Right, you take them to the pediatrician, they do a quick surgery, and the kid is fine a week later.
In 1700, there is no anesthesia. There is no concept of sterilization. A hernia in a child was a lifelong, debilitating, and potentially fatal affliction.
Oh, wow.
Because infant mortality was staggeringly high, even for royals, they viewed the child's body as incredibly fragile, almost like spun glass.
Just ready to shatter at any moment.
Exactly. Every intense cry, every hard run down a hallway, getting a little too close to a fireplace, it was all viewed as a potential catalyst for a physical breakdown. And remember, if that heir's body breaks, the dynasty is in jeopardy.
So the stakes are apocalyptic. You have the nurse acting as this heavily regulated humoral nutritional source.
Yes.
And then the governess acting as a hypervigilant physical shield, genuinely terrified that a temper tantrum will rupture the kid's internal organs and end the family bloodline.
Exactly. But let's say they succeed. The women of the household keep the child physically intact through the intense peril of early childhood.
Okay, they made it to childhood.
Around the age of 6 or 7, the entire focus of the household violently shifts. It pivots from basic physical survival to moral and intellectual shaping.
The physical to the mental.
The child is no longer just a body to be kept alive. They are a mind to be molded. Enter the governor.
The preceptor. This is where the real boot camp begins.
Oh, absolutely.
This is where the threat evolves from a biological one, dying of a hernia, to a social one, the threat of bad manners.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, bad manners don't just look bad. They destroy estates.
Because of the whole Versailles social scene.
Exactly. The manual explicitly states that bad impressions lead to prodigality, debauchery, and the ruin of noble houses. If the child doesn't know how to behave, they will gamble away the fortune or fall out of favor with the king.
Oediger uses a brilliant metaphor in the text here. He calls children sauvageons, wild saplings.
The wild saplings, yes.
He says that left to their own devices, children are just wild wood. The governor is described as the agriculturist.
The gardener.
His entire job is to graft good examples, prudence, and probity onto this wild sapling so that it eventually bears good fruit.
That metaphor reveals a deeply controlling, almost aggressive philosophy of education. Think about what grafting actually is in botany.
You're cutting the plant.
You are cutting into a plant and forcing a foreign branch into the wound so they heal together. You aren't nurturing the child's natural inclinations. You are fundamentally altering their core nature through external structural force.
That is such a stark contrast to how we think about childhood today. We usually think of children as these pure, innocent slates that society corrupts.
Right, which is the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Decades after Oediger wrote this manual, Rousseau famously argued during the Enlightenment that children are born naturally good, and it's the strict rules of society that ruin them.
Okay, so total opposite.
Rousseau wanted children to learn freely from nature, but Oediger, representing the older, deeply entrenched aristocratic view, believes the exact opposite. Children are born wild, chaotic, and inherently dangerous to the social order.
They must be broken, pruned, and grafted.
Precisely.
And to be that unyielding force, the governor's qualifications are ironclad. He cannot be a fun, energetic young tutor.
No fun allowed.
The manual says he must be an older man, grave and prudent. Why? To inspire fear and absolute respect.
He has a massive curriculum to enforce.
Right? He has to teach them holy history, manage every single piece of paper they read, ensure they pray morning and night, and march them to mass.
And notice the underlying theme of his job description: total, unblinking surveillance.
It's intense.
The text orders the governor to never leave the children for a single moment. He regulates their meals, he regulates their sleep, he strictly forbids them from associating with what Oediger calls badly raised people.
The psychological weight of that is just staggering. Just imagine you are a 10-year-old noble in this house.
It would be exhausting.
You have a grave, unsmiling elderly man staring at you from the moment you open your eyes in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night. He is always there.
Yeah.
He never shows emotion.
And he's not supposed to.
Yeah.
The manual dictates that the governor must always appear with a perfectly even temper, Never troubled, always peaceful and grave.
He is just sitting in the corner of the room, watching, waiting for his graft of virtue to take hold. It is a total lack of privacy.
It sounds incredibly suffocating to us today. But to the 18th century noble mind, leaving a child alone meant leaving them vulnerable to their own base, wild nature.
Or to the servants.
Exactly, or worse, to the corrupting influence of lower-class servants. The governor's unblinking gaze was the only thing preventing the child from sliding into social ruin. He had to be a walking, breathing monolith of morality.
But I have to ask, even a walking monolith of morality needs to sleep eventually.
True.
And realistically, a grave, elderly scholar in powdered wigs and heavy coats isn't going to be the one scrubbing mud off a young noble's stockings, especially when the kid gets a bit older and starts venturing out of the house to attend college.
Right, he's not doing the laundry.
If the governor is supposed to be watching them 24/7, how does that actually work in practice? Isn't there a logistical gap here?
That is a great question, and Oettinger anticipates it. The governor manages the mind, the soul, and the grand strategy of the child's life. But the actual dirt of daily life, the physical movement through the streets, required another specialist, a tactician. That brings us to the boots on the ground, the children's valet.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we think of this in modern corporate terms. The governor is the chief compliance officer.
I like that.
Sits in the office, writes the strict behavioral policies, and sets the moral standard.
And the valet.
The valet is the internal auditor conducting random checks out in the field, because the daily grind for this guy was intense.
It was nonstop.
The valet managed all the physical upkeep that was beneath the governor. He was cleaning and mending the expensive linen, the stockings, the shoes, the hats. He had to comb the children's hair perfectly and keep their rooms absolutely spotless.
Yes, he is the physical bodyguard. Because the governor is older and perhaps less physically agile, the valet is the one tasked with physically following the children everywhere.
Like a shadow.
His literal job description includes preventing them from falling or hurting themselves.
But he isn't just catching them when they trip over a cobblestone. He is the moral enforcer in the trenches.
Yes.
The manual explicitly states the valet has to prevent the children from saying anything indecent, gross, or dishonest.
Because again, any contact with the outside world, even the world of other wealthy children at a college, was seen as a massive vector for moral disease.
So the valet is like running interference.
The valet was the hazmat suit, protecting the noble child from the contamination of regular society. He has to swat away the bad words and the cruel humor before it infects the air.
And here is the mechanism of how this all actually worked, which is both brilliant and terrifying.
Oh, the reporting system.
Yes. The text notes that the valet must escort the children to and from college, and then he is required to report everything they did wrong in his absence directly back to the governor.
So the governor, maintaining his grave distance, can deliver the proper calculated reprimands.
Exactly. The valet isn't just a guy who irons shirts. He functions as the eyes and ears of the governor's surveillance state.
He's an informant.
You're a young noble, and you think you're safe because the grave old man stayed home today. You let your guard down, you tell a slightly off-color joke to a friend at college, or you get into a scuffle.
But your valet is standing right there?
Taking mental notes, just waiting to run back and report your moral failings to the chief compliance officer.
It perfectly completes the system. You have an unbroken chain of custody over the child's life.
From birth to adulthood.
The nurse provides the perfectly untainted, humorally balanced physical sustenance. The governess provides the hyper-vigilant physical safety, guarding against the deadly hernias.
Right.
The governor provides the overarching moral, religious, and intellectual framework, and the valet enforces that framework out in the chaotic real world.
It is a flawless, terrifying, inescapable machine.
And that is really the core insight we can draw from Oettinger's manual. When we look at the year 1700, raising a noble child wasn't parenting, as we conceptualize it.
No, it wasn't about love and affection.
It was a highly organized, heavily financed institutional operation. Every single aspect of the child's hygiene, morality, religious instruction, and daily schedule was outsourced to highly specialized staff.
And crucially, the lives, diets, and livelihoods of that staff were strictly policed to ensure they successfully manufactured the perfect aristocratic product.
Manufactured is the perfect word for it.
Pulling this all together, it really makes you reevaluate our modern anxieties. You know, today you are constantly bombarded with information overload about how to optimally raise children.
Oh, everywhere you look.
We agonize over whether they're getting too much screen time, if they're eating the right organic foods, or if we're using the exact right gentle parenting techniques to foster their emotional growth.
We definitely feel like we're the first generation to invent this overwhelming obsession with optimizing childhood.
We really do. But this deep dive into La Maison Reglée shows that the obsession with totally controlling a child's environment and the apocalyptic fear of what happens if you fail is centuries old.
They were just as paranoid as we are.
They were. They just used a humor-regulated nurse and a reporting valet instead of a nanny cam and a screen time limiting app on an iPad.
The tools change, the medical science evolves, but the core anxiety remains entirely the same. We still view children as these wild saplings that desperately need to be grafted into functioning members of our specific society.
We just hide the mechanics of that grafting process a little better today. We don't employ grave elderly men to stare at them 24 hours a day.
Well, most of us don't anyway.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to consider. We've seen how utterly terrified the 18th century French nobility was of their children picking up cruel humor or the kind of debauchery that ruins estates.
Right.
So imagine if someone were to write a modern Maison Reglée for today's hyper-connected world. What modern wild sapling behaviors do you think parents today would be most desperate to hire a grave, unblinking governor to graft away?